If you don't have time or energy to spend hours hand stitching your quilt bindings, or maybe you're dealing with hand pain or arthritis, this video is for you. Hi, my name is Beth Ann Williams. I've been a quilter with physical challenges for many years, and I've got your back. I'll walk you through a polished, beginner-friendly method for binding your quilt entirely by machine. No hand sewing required, and no sacrifice in quality. Side note, this is one of many different techniques I teach in my online class, Easy Machine Bindings That Still Look Great. And you can learn this technique today for free. I've included timestamps in the description box below the video so that you can easily find any particular section you'd like to play or replay. I've also included links in the descriptions for some of the tools or products that you'll see me using. But don't worry if you don't have those specific products. There are workarounds, and these techniques can still work for you. We're going to make a classic French fold or double fold binding, and that's just two names for the same thing, as it provides a durable, long-lasting finish. It is cut twice as wide as a single fold binding because it's pressed in half before being sewn to the quilt. That means there will be a double layer of fabric on the outer edge of the quilt, which helps the binding last longer as the quilt is being used. The width of a French fold or double fold binding is usually the same on the back of the quilt as it is on the front of the quilt. But for this method, we'll begin by sewing on the back side of the quilt with a narrower 1/4 inch wide seam allowance. This is going to be a game changer when we sew the binding to the front of the quilt because we won't have to worry about catching the binding on the back of the quilt. Don't worry if that doesn't make sense yet. It will when we get to that point. But first, let's back up to the beginning. Notice that we're starting with a trimmed quilt. All the excess batting and backing fabric have been cut away. The corners of the quilt are square, and the sides are nice and even. This next step is optional, but I do highly recommend it. I like to stay stitch inside the seam allowance around the outer edge of my quilt with a longer basting stitch. And what I mean is if you normally sew with a stitch length of 2.0, try lengthening it to 3.5. Or if you normally sew with a stitch length of 2.5, try 4.0. Just a little bit longer than what you normally would use. I have another quick tip you might find helpful. Because this binding is going to be more than a 1/4 inch wide on the front of the quilt, and I don't like to cut off the tips of any triangles or throw off the proportions of any small pieced blocks, I may choose to add a border of some kind to my quilt top if there isn't one already. It might be skinny and pretty subtle, like the border for this quilt, or it might be wider, like the border I used for this one. For this quilt, which is folded in the photo, I used a border fabric that blends right in with the piecing. And I chose not to add side borders to this Easy Pieces quilt since there are no sharp points or skinny details to worry about getting covered by the binding. There are no rules about borders. You can do whatever you like best. So this is just a suggestion. Moving on. Let's talk about cutting the strips for our binding. When you buy fabric and is cut on the bolt at the store, it is cut on the cross grain from selvage to selvage. This is also the easiest way to cut binding strips. Now, there's nothing wrong with bias binding, but unless I'm binding a very curvy edge, or I prefer the way the fabric looks when it's cut on the bias, I prefer to avoid bias cut binding for the following reasons. It typically uses more fabric. Bias binding has more stretch and may cause the edges of the quilt to become wavy, and it's a lot fussier to make. So We're going to use binding strips cut on the cross grain today. We'll cut the strips 2.5 inches wide, as that will be easier on our hands when we wrap the binding around the edge of the quilt, but will still give us a nice, full binding. Let's see what this will look like in action. First, fold the fabric in half, selvage to selvage. The selvages may not line up exactly, and that's okay as long as there aren't any ripples or pulling along the fold line of the fabric. Sliver trim one edge to get a clean cut to work from, and which edge will depend on whether you're right-handed or left-handed. Use a 24 or 24.5 inch ruler, preferably a non-slip ruler, to measure over 2.5 inches. Another side note, if I'm having a good hand day, I cut my strips 2.25 inches wide and pull them tight when I wrap them around the quilt. But if my hands are particularly achy, I go with 2.5 inches, which is what I'm recommending in this tutorial, so that I have a little more leeway. The binding will still be nice and full, but it's not as hard on your hands. Either way, make the cut. And it comes both in a right-handed version and a left-handed version. And back to our binding strips. Most commercial patterns will tell you how many binding strips to cut. But if your pattern doesn't tell you, or if the quilt is your own design, there's a simple way to figure it out. I prefer to have a little extra binding left over rather than risk running short, so here's the formula that I use. First, I measure all the way around the outer edge of the quilt and add an extra 10 to 12 inches for overlap and joins. This is the total number of inches of binding needed. Then, I divide that number by 40 inches, the approximate usable width of the fabric on the cross grain, and then round up the result to the next whole number. That's the number of strips I'll need. For the throw size quilt I'm cutting this binding for, I'll need 6 binding strips. Now we'll need to sew the strips together. A diagonal joint is generally preferred as it distributes the bulk of the seam allowances gradually and along a wider area instead of creating a noticeable lump in just one spot. The binding strips should be placed right sides together in an L shape. This photo shows the strips with the selvages trimmed off before joining the strips. Many folks find it helpful to mark the diagonal stitching line. Make sure you've set your stitch length back to normal before you start sewing these together. I find it easier to sew the diagonal seams without marking or having the machine eat the fabric at the beginning of the seam if I first offset the ends of the strips so that a little bit of fabric is peeking out. The selvages are perfect for this. This lets me sew from crevice to crevice where the fabrics overlap. I've highlighted these spots with stars in the photo. I'm showing this without pins because I didn't want the photo to get any more cluttered, but go ahead and pin if you find it helpful. I like to chain sew the strips, one right after the other, and then cut the threads between the joins. Before trimming the corners, I like to open up the joins to make sure they look right, which this does. I then trim off the excess fabric, leaving a 1/4 inch seam allowance past my stitching line, and press the seams open. This method will help us avoid bulky, visible, lumpy joins in the finished binding. The binding is now one continuous strip. Now we're ready to press the binding in half lengthwise, pretty side showing, carefully lining up the cut edges with each other. Press with the grain of the fabric, short strokes from the fold to the raw edges of the binding, not on a slant. Don't slide the iron on the bias, as that will stretch the fabric and can push the edges of the binding out of alignment, which can cause weird tucks and ripples later. Let's take a minute to talk about managing the binding while we're sewing it to the quilt. When I first learned how to bind my quilts, I would have the full length of the binding spread over my lap or on the floor, sometimes getting caught in my chair or snagged by one of our kitties. One option, I love using the Binding Babies and Flower Spindle system to wind my prepared binding and for easy unspooling when I sew it on. Aren't they cute? Another option, a nice fat spool of thread and a piece of painter's tape to secure the end of the binding may not be as aesthetically pleasing as the Binding Baby, but it can work just as well. Here I have the binding feeding off an extra vertical spool pin for my sewing machine. If you don't have an extra vertical spool pin, a thread stand sitting right next to your machine work well too. These options would also work well for the Binding Baby if you don't have the flower spindle. Now let's talk through sewing the binding first to the back of the quilt. If you have a way to spread the quilt out, I recommend picking a starting point and laying the binding loosely around the quilt so that you can see where the joins in the binding will fall. I try to make sure those seams don't fall right in the corner of a quilt because then they're going to make the mitering more difficult. It's a little hard to see in this photo, so I added a black line over the joint in the binding fabric. I definitely want to avoid having to deal with the extra bulk of the join when I'm mitering my binding, so I'm going to adjust this binding by shifting it up or down a few inches before I start sewing. Here's an example of when I forgot to test the binding placement and ended up with a join falling right in the corner. It's hard to see, so I added a white line on top of the join or seam line so that you can tell where it is. It's not the end of the world, but it will make completing a perfect miter on the other side of the quilt a little bulkier and a little more challenging later. Speaking of bulk, sewing a binding onto a large quilt can be quite the physical workout. I find it helpful to place a large board on my work table next to me. This creates an L shape on my left side so that the quilt is supported as I'm working and not all piled up in my lap or over my shoulder. Depending on the size of the quilt, I might also arrange it in loose folds or pleats so that it's easier to feed into the machine. I also find it helpful to wear a quilting glove on at least my left hand. This gives me better traction when handling the quilt, and it reduces the amount of strength needed to keep the edge of the quilt straight as it goes through the machine instead of veering off to one side. Now let's look at how we get started actually sewing the binding. I'll be switching quilts to show you the tuck-in method. This is my favorite way to start and end a quilt binding on an everyday quilt. It's the easiest and fastest, but it's still nicely finished and very secure. I'm starting by temporarily unfolding the binding, trimming the beginning end of the strip at a 45-degree angle, and then pressing over a 1/4-inch seam allowance. And take note of the direction of this cut. When you're looking at the beginning end of the binding, the high side of the angle should be on the right-hand side. I'm using a 1/4-inch seam allowance to attach the binding to the back side of the quilt, and I'm using a locking stitch or back stitch to secure my threads at the very beginning of the stitching. In this photo, I'm anchoring the beginning of the binding by sewing the first 6 inches or so of the opened binding through the bottom layer only. And here's a quick tip. Since we're sewing through a lot of layers and it's pretty thick, you might find it helpful to adjust your stitch length just a bit, such as from 2.5 to 3.0, just a little bit. After stitching about 6 inches through just the bottom layer, I'll stop, backstitch, cut my threads, and refold the strip. I'll start again with another locking stitch or backstitch and resume sewing the binding through both layers from that point onwards. This will leave an open pocket at the beginning of the binding. A 1/4 inch foot can be awesome for sewing the binding to the back of the quilt. 3 different models are shown here. If you choose a model that has a guide blade, like the first 2 presser feet shown in this photo, be sure to check to make sure you're getting a true 1/4 inch seam allowance, as sometimes it's a bit wider. These feet also usually have marks that can help you gauge when you are a 1/4 inch away from the edge of the quilt, in the front of the foot as well as on the side of the foot. This is a great help for perfect miters on the first side of the quilt. But if you notice that drag from your presser foot is causing the binding to stretch or bubble, try switching to a walking foot. Yours may look a little bit different from the one pictured here, but the important thing is that the feed dogs in the foot work in concert with the feed dogs in your machine to feed all the layers through your machine evenly. Make sure that the foot is installed correctly so that it does its job. Now let's talk about mitering the corners. Since I'm using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, I'll stop with my needle down in the fabric 1/4 inch away from the lower edge of the quilt. Many presser feet have a mark that you can use to judge when to stop stitching. If yours doesn't have a mark you can easily see, you might want to stop a couple inches away before you get to the corner and make a short pencil mark 1/4 inch away from the edge of the quilt so that you'll know where to stop. Then we'll rotate the quilt slightly and stitch right off the corner of the quilt, straight through the point at the corner of the quilt. This photo shows what that stitching looks like. You can also see that I haven't cut my threads, I just moved them out of the way. Next, I'll fold the binding strip back over and away from the quilt, making sure that the new fold is even with the outer edge of the quilt. Now I'll bring the binding strip back over the quilt, making sure that the new folds are even with the outer edge of the quilt. Then I'll slide the quilt back under my presser foot and resume stitching at or just a couple of threads in from the corner. That's all there is to it at this point. Now I can keep stitching until I get to the next corner where I'll repeat the process. Here's a quick review at half speed. We're approaching the corner, stopping with the needle down, raising the presser foot, pivoting slightly so we can stitch right off that corner, right through the point. This is what's creating the miter. All right, and then once we're off the quilt, we'll raise the needle and raise the presser foot. And then rotate the quilt back around. Here it comes. And we'll fold that binding away from the quilt right along that stitched angle and then back down again, making sure that the pleat at the top of the quilt is lined up with the other edge of the binding. Hold that flat with your fingers. Make sure it's also lined up on the side as well as the top. Slide it back into the machine, and you can just move that loop of thread out of the way. You don't have to cut it. Just thread it under the foot and out of the way, and then start stitching again, either right at the corner, or if you find that your machine doesn't want to go forward at the corner, a couple of threads in sometimes is a little bit easier. Here my machine is doing a locking stitch. Sometimes you have to give it a little bit of encouragement just to get it started again. And here we go. There it goes. All right. I'm switching quilts again to show this next bit. When I approach the beginning of the binding, I've done all 4 corners back to where I started. I'll unfold the binding strip and trim the end to the same 45-degree angle that I used before, but this time I don't need to fold over a seam allowance. Then I'll refold the strip and tuck the end of the binding that we just trimmed into that pocket created at the beginning of the binding. After making sure that all the cut edges of the binding are lined up carefully with the outer edge of the quilt, I'll continue sewing the binding to the quilt the rest of the way, ending with a locking stitch or back stitch when I get back to where I started. Jumping ahead for just a minute, on a finished quilt, this method will create the appearance of a bias join that is slightly higher on one side because the seam allowances are all on the same side. If I were hand finishing this binding, I would probably take a few stitches to tighten up that overlapped area. But when I'm machine finishing, I leave them as they are. They're still very secure. And this join is barely visible on the 5/8 inch wide blue binding. And back to our other quilts. Now that the binding has been sewn to the back of the quilt, let's prepare it for wrapping around to the front. This priming step is optional, but I find that it really helps create a nice, crisp, finished binding, and it reduces the stress on my hands when I'm wrapping the binding around in the next step. I'm gently pulling the binding away from the stitching and pressing towards the outer fold with a hot, dry iron. And again, I'm pressing with the grain of the fabric, moving the tip of the iron from the seam line to the outer fold of the binding in short strokes. Because the corners are mitered, they won't lie flat at this point, but I can still use the tip of my iron to get in there. The next step is to flip the quilt over and start wrapping the binding around the edge of the quilt. I find that with all these layers, clips are much easier to use than pins, but the choice is up to you. I think glue basting is the easiest method of all. The key here is to use water-soluble or washable glue so that you'll be able to wash it out and won't need to worry about any long-term effects on your quilt. The fine applicator tip on Roxanne's Glue Baste is wonderful, as you only need a very tiny amount of glue, and the easy squeeze bottle shown in this photo is fantastic. Unfortunately, I can't recommend the original bottle as you have to really squeeze quite firmly, and I have a hard time with that. Elmer's washable school glue is an economical and easy to find option, but you have to be careful not to let the glue glop out. You only need a thin line or row of drops of glue. And this photo is actually on the generous side as I was trying to get the glue to show up in the photo. You don't want the glue to be so thick that it soaks through the fabric or gets on your iron later. Whichever glue I use, I always make sure to heat set the glue by pressing the fabric with a hot dry iron as I work my way around the quilt, about 18 inches or so at a time. That way, it'll hold the binding securely in place without leaving a sticky residue on my sewing machine needle later. If your binding starts to look a little wonky as you're wrapping the binding around, try keeping a long ruler handy and use it as a guide to help you keep the binding nice and straight and even as you work. Now let's look at how I'm going to finish the miter on this corner. It's a lot like wrapping a present. I begin by bringing one side of the binding straight over onto the quilt, making sure that the binding forms a 45-degree angle at the corner. Then I bring up the next side of the binding and check to make sure the miter is tidy before gluing the binding down. The miter will form naturally, but sometimes you might need to finesse it. The bulk inside the miter should be on the opposite side of the bulk inside the miter on the back side. That way, the bulk will be evenly distributed and your corner will be nice and flat. Here's a quick review at half speed. I'm pressing that down. You can see the 45-degree angle forming, and I'm just going to use my fingernail to kind of set a little crease there. And then I'm bringing it straight up. You can see the miter is forming. There it is. And next, I'm going to grab a clip to hold that in place. Now at this point, I could continue clipping, or I could go back and unclip it and add some glue and heat set it. A quick note, the miter on the front of the quilt should be nice and tight enough that you won't need to stitch the highlighted area. On the home stretch, we're almost ready to start top stitching the binding on the front of the quilt. For this technique, I recommend choosing a top thread that will blend with the binding fabric and a bobbin thread that will blend with the fabric on the back of the quilt. This is how it looks when it's finished. The top thread blends with the binding and the bobbin thread blends with the backing fabric. This really gives it a nice finished look. My go-to for sewing a quilt binding is a size 7511 quilting needle, as it has a strong reinforced shaft and a very sharp point that helps it to go through all these layers. A top stitch needle, size 8012, or even a jeans needle would also work well. We can often make our job easier and possibly our stitching more accurate by selecting a presser foot that will help. If you get ripples or tucks because the layers aren't feeding through your machine all at the same time, try sewing your binding on both sides with a walking foot or even feed foot. And again, the correct model for your machine might look a little different from the one pictured here. However, if your machine has a built-in dual feed or an automatic sensor system, you might have other options. This can be helpful because the potential downside of the walking foot is diminished visibility. It's a lot harder to see what's happening around the needle. The zigzag foot that comes standard with most machines can be used for sewing the binding to the front of the quilt, but it's not always my first choice. One of my favorite presser feet is the open toe applique foot. It offers superior visibility because it's wide open in front of the needle, and the groove on the underside of the foot helps it glide smoothly over the edge of the binding. Another foot that I love for top stitching a binding on the front of a quilt is the stitch in the ditch or edge joining foot. The version that I have has a guide that rides right in the ditch or seam line. This is a great option provided you can move your needle position to the right, as is shown in the photo. So make sure you can do that if you want to use this foot. The guide will ride right in the ditch or seam line. With the needle moved to the right, it can help you top stitch right next to the ditch instead of in the ditch. I find this works particularly well if the binding has been glue basted, as the layers are nice and stable. A note, when you're using a presser foot with a guide blade, you may sometimes find yourself in a position where you need to continue stitching past the point where the blade bumps up against the binding on the next side of the quilt. Slow down. You'll probably need to stop and raise the presser foot in order to smooth out the binding before pivoting and lowering the foot to continue stitching. And away we go. Top stitch around the entire binding 1/8 inch from the folded edge. And note that it's not critical that it's exactly 1/8 inch. It's most important that the width is as consistent as you can make it. If my eyes are good that day, I like to sew right next to the folded edge, about 1/16 of an inch away. Stop with your needle down and pivot at the corners. Ideally, your turning point should be right on the angled line of the miter. Keep stitching until you get back to where you started. Overlap that initial stitching by about 1/2 inch and then use a back stitch or locking stitch to secure your threads. Ta-da! Clip any loose threads and enjoy your beautifully finished quilt. There's a lot of useful information and links in the description box below the video, so check it out. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you found this helpful. Happy quilting!